I spent 12 years as a trail inspector for the U.S. Forest Service, believing that everything in the woods had a rational explanation. But when a veteran maintenance crew walked off the job and refused to enter Section 12 because the forest felt wrong, I hiked in to investigate and found a scene that defied physics. Massive trees were snapped like toothpicks, and 400-pound stumps were stacked in a barricade that no machine could have built. I went in looking for vandalism, but I ended up walking into the middle of a desperate war between a hidden civilization and a corporation trying to destroy them. Before we head into the restricted zone, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want to hear more true stories about the secrets the government keeps about the deep woods, hit that subscribe button. This is the story of how I became the guardian of a secret nation. I've been a trail inspector for the U.S. Forest Service for 12 years, and I pride myself on being a man of logic, measurements, and erosion tables. I've seen everything the Pacific Northwest can throw at a trail system. Washouts from atmospheric rivers, bare vandalism on signage, and the chaotic mess left behind by illegal campers. My job is simple: assess the damage, calculate the resources needed for repair, and keep the hikers safe. I don't deal in ghost stories or campfire myths. I deal in cubic yards of gravel and chainsaw fuel. So when my supervisor, David Rodriguez, called me into his office on a Tuesday morning with a look of genuine unease on his face, I expected a budget cut, not a mystery. David closed the door behind me, a rarity in our open-plan station, and slid a clipboard across his desk with a heavy sigh. "It's Section 12 of the Lewis River system," he said, rubbing his temples as if fighting a migraine. "I need you to go out there personally, Marcus. No interns, no seasonal hires, just you." He explained that our veteran maintenance crew, tough guys who spend their summers swinging Pulaskis and sleeping in the dirt, had walked off the job 3 days in a row. They weren't complaining about pay or hours. They were refusing to go back because they claimed the woods felt wrong, vibrating with a hostility they couldn't explain but refused to challenge. I laughed at first, assuming it was a prank or an elaborate excuse to get out of the heavy brush clearing scheduled for that sector. "Since when do we let bad vibes dictate the maintenance schedule?" I asked, picking up the clipboard. David didn't smile. He told me that the crew reported inexplicable damage, massive trees blocking the trail that hadn't been there the day before, despite 0 wind events reported in the area. They claimed tools went missing and reappeared bent, and that the silence in that valley was so heavy it made their ears ring. He needed a sanity check. He needed his most cynical inspector to go out there and find the rational explanation. I packed the truck that afternoon, throwing in my standard loadout: measuring tapes, a clinometer, a heavy-duty chainsaw, and my camera for documentation. The drive out to the Lewis River drainage was familiar. A winding ribbon of asphalt that eventually turned into washboard gravel, climbing higher into the dense canopy of Douglas fir and hemlock. The rain was falling in a steady gray drizzle, the kind that soaks you to the bone and turns the forest into a blur of green and brown. I wasn't worried about ghosts. I was worried about mudslides and how I was going to write up a report that didn't make the crew look like cowards. When I reached the trailhead for Section 12, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Usually, even in the rain, you hear the chatter of jays, the chattering of squirrels, or the distant hum of the river. But as I stepped out of the truck and locked the door, the woods were dead quiet, a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural. The air felt thick, static-charged, like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike, raising the hair on my arms despite the damp cold. I shook it off, grabbing my pack and my hard hat, reminding myself that silence isn't a metric I can put in a report. I hadn't hiked more than a mile when I found the first anomaly, and it stopped me in my tracks. A massive western hemlock, easily 3 feet in diameter, lay across the trail. It hadn't snapped in the wind. The root ball was intact, ripped violently from the earth with a force that defied physics. There were no skid marks from heavy machinery, no tire tracks, no sign of a winch. It looked as if a giant hand had simply pushed the tree over like a domino. I walked around the root system, looking for saw marks or cable scars, but the wood was pristine. This was brute force, raw and terrifyingly focused. 100 yards further up the trail, the destruction escalated from obstruction to vandalism. Several large stumps, remnants of old logging operations from the 50s, had been uprooted and displaced. These were dense, resin-filled chunks of wood weighing easily 400 pounds each, moved 20 feet off the trail and stacked in a crude, deliberate pile. I tried to push one with my boot. It didn't budge an inch. To move these without a machine would require the strength of 10 men, yet the moss around them was barely disturbed. It was a display of power that felt performative, a warning sign constructed from the forest itself. I took photos, my flash illuminating the gray afternoon, trying to find the logical thread that tied this chaos together. I knelt to examine the earth near the stacked stumps and found deep gouges in the mud. They weren't the erratic tearing of a bear seeking grubs. They were long, furrowed trenches, as if 5 iron rakes had been dragged through the soil simultaneously. I measured the width, far too wide for a grizzly, and the depth suggested immense downward pressure. My rational mind tried to fit the data into a box, maybe a landslide, maybe a freak microburst, but the geometry of the damage was too precise. The further I pushed into Section 12, the more the trail disappeared under a carpet of debris. Saplings were twisted and snapped at a height of 7 feet, broken not by impact, but by torque, as if something had grabbed them and wrung them out like wet towels. I found rocks the size of watermelons embedded in the trunks of soft fir trees, thrown with enough velocity to shatter the bark and stick. This wasn't natural decay or weather. This was a tantrum. Someone, or something, was systematically dismantling the trail to make it impassable. I stopped to change the battery in my camera, the silence pressing in on me harder now. I felt exposed, a bright orange vest in a sea of hostile green. I scanned the tree line, looking for the flicker of movement, the flash of a jacket, anything to indicate a human vandal. There was nothing but the swaying of the branches. But as I stood up, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Not a person, but a dark shape further up the trail, standing near a bend. It vanished before I could focus, but it left me with the distinct prickling sensation that I had walked into a room where I wasn't welcome, and the owner was watching. I rounded a sharp switchback, intending to photograph a particularly violent slash mark on a cedar tree, when I saw him. He was sitting on a fallen log about 30 feet off the trail, motionless as a statue, watching me with a calm intensity that was unnerving. He was an older Native American man, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and work boots that had seen better decades. He didn't look like a hiker. He carried no pack, no water bottle, no trekking poles. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, looking completely at ease in a forest that had terrified my maintenance crew. He looked less like a visitor and more like a permanent feature of the landscape, like the ferns or the moss. I immediately slipped into my official persona, adjusting my hard hat and stepping forward. "Sir," I called out, projecting my voice to bridge the distance. "This section of the trail is closed for maintenance. It's not safe for public access right now." I expected him to act surprised or apologetic, the usual reaction from locals caught shortcutting through closed zones. Instead, he just nodded slowly, as if confirming a sad fact. "It hasn't been safe for a long time, Ranger," he said, his voice gravelly and deep. "But the danger isn't falling branches. You've walked past 3 warning signs already. Why are you still walking forward?" I stopped, annoyed by the cryptic response. I walked over to him, intending to escort him back to the trailhead, but something in his demeanor made me pause. He introduced himself as Joseph Graybear, an elder from the local tribe whose reservation bordered the national forest. "I'm not here to hike," he told me, standing up slowly. "I'm here to see if the boundary holds." He gestured to the destruction around us, the twisted saplings, the uprooted stumps. "You see vandalism, Marcus," he said, using my name, though I hadn't given it. "I see a fence being built. They are closing the door." I frowned, looking at the devastation. "Who is they, Joseph? If you know who's doing this, you need to tell me. This is federal property." He looked at me with a pitying smile. "It was their property long before your government drew lines on a map," he said softly. "My people call them the forest people. You probably have a different, sillier name for them. We have kept a peace with them for generations. We leave them the deep valleys. We leave offerings at the crossings, and we never ever bring machines into their nursery grounds. But someone has forgotten the rules." My skepticism flared. I was a man of science, and he was talking about Sasquatch as if they were difficult neighbors. "With all due respect," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. "Bears don't stack 400-pound stumps in a pyramid, and men don't snap fir trees like toothpicks." Joseph didn't blink. "Exactly," he said. "Men didn't do this. This is a display of strength. It is a language. They are screaming at you to turn back. The damage isn't random chaos, it is a barricade. They are scared, Marcus, and a scared giant is a dangerous thing." He explained that his grandfather had forged a silent treaty with the creatures 80 years ago, a mutual avoidance pact that ensured safety for both species. "We don't hunt in Section 12, he said. "We don't harvest berries past the ridge. In return, they don't come down to the reservation houses. It is a balance. But look at this." He pointed to a deep gouge in the earth. "This is aggression. Something has disturbed them deeply to make them push this far out. You aren't investigating a crime scene. You are standing in a war zone." I wanted to dismiss him, to tell him to take his folklore back to the trailhead, but I couldn't ignore the physical evidence surrounding us. I looked at the twisted trees and the displaced boulders, and my engineer's brain struggled to find a mechanism for the movement. If it wasn't a machine, and it wasn't a man, the variable X remained undefined. Joseph saw my hesitation. "Your mind wants to reject it," he said, "but your gut knows. You feel the static in the air. That is the pressure of being watched by something that can crush you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. He held it out to me. "Tobacco and sage," he said. "It is not magic. It is a gesture. If you insist on going deeper, you must show respect. You must announce that you are not the enemy." I took the pouch, feeling foolish, the dry leaves crunching in my grip. "I'm just here to survey the trail, Joseph," I said, though my voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm not looking for trouble. Trouble has already found you," he replied grimly. "Listen to me closely. If you hear wood knocking, a sharp, heavy sound like a baseball bat hitting a tree, you count. 3 knocks is a warning. It means, I see you, go away. If you hear more than 3, if the rhythm breaks and comes from 2 sides." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "That is a flanking maneuver. That means the negotiation is over. You drop your gear and you run." I stood there holding the pouch of tobacco, watching Joseph turn and begin his slow walk back down the trail. He moved with a quiet dignity, leaving me alone in the unnatural silence of Section 12. I looked at the sun, which was beginning to dip toward the western ridge, casting long, distorted shadows through the broken timber. I had a job to do, a report to file, and I wasn't going to let an old man's stories stop me. But as I turned to face the darkening tunnel of the trail ahead, I tightened my grip on the leather pouch, wondering if 3 knocks would sound different than the beating of my own heart. I watched Joseph disappear around the bend, the pouch of tobacco heavy and ridiculous in my hand. Part of me wanted to follow him back to the truck, to file a report about unsafe conditions and go home to a warm dinner. But the bureaucratic side of my brain, the side that needed to quantify the damage for the budget request, won the argument. I tucked the pouch into my vest pocket, gripped my hiking poles, and crossed the invisible line Joseph had warned me about. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The air grew cooler, stagnant, and heavy with the smell of pine resin and deep wet earth, as if the forest was holding its breath. A mile past the meeting spot, the trail effectively dissolved into a game trail, overgrown and wild. It was here, in a patch of soft mud near a dried creek bed, that I found the evidence that shattered my skepticism. It was a footprint, deep and distinct, pressed inches into the clay. I dropped my pack and pulled out my tape measure, my hands shaking slightly. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. I looked for the telltale signs of a double step, a bear placing its hind foot in the track of its front. But the stride length between this print and the next was 5 feet. Nothing on 2 legs or 4 in the Pacific Northwest moved like that. I pushed forward, my senses heightened to a painful degree, scanning every shadow. The vegetation became thicker, devil's club and vine maple weaving a dense net that snagged my clothes. In a small clearing, I stumbled upon a structure that defied explanation. It wasn't a nest or a den, it was a shelter. Massive saplings, some as thick as my arm, had been snapped and woven together into a complex A-frame, anchored by boulders I couldn't have lifted. There was no twine, no nails, just the brutal physics of tension and weight. It was crude, yes, but it demonstrated an architectural intelligence that unnerved me. Caught on a splinter of one of the structural branches, about 7 feet off the ground, was a tuft of hair. I pulled it free, rolling the coarse strands between my fingers. It was dark brown, almost black, with a reddish tint in the fading sunlight. It felt thicker than bear fur, more like wire than hair. I bagged it, labeling it with trembling fingers, realizing that I was collecting biological evidence of a species that wasn't supposed to exist. The woods felt tighter now, the trees crowding in like prison bars. The sun began to dip below the ridgeline, turning the sky a bruised purple. And I knew I wouldn't make it back to the truck before dark. I decided to make camp at the ruins of the old fire lookout, a concrete slab that offered a flat surface and a 360-degree view. Though the tower itself was long gone, I set up my small tent on the concrete foundation, the hard surface feeling safer than the forest floor. I built a small fire in the remains of the old hearth, the flames casting erratic shadows against the encroaching wall of fir trees. Night fell with a sudden, absolute darkness that felt oppressive. The silence that had plagued the afternoon was broken by the sound of movement, heavy, deliberate movement. Thump, thump, thump. It was the cadence of a bipedal walk, heavy footfalls that vibrated the ground, circling my camp just beyond the ring of my firelight. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of a deer or the shuffle of a bear. It was the pacing of a sentry. I grabbed my flashlight, beaming it into the trees. but the light was swallowed by the density of the brush. Then came the smell, a pungent, overpowering wave of musk, like wet dog mixed with sulfur and rotten vegetation. It made my eyes water and my stomach turn. And then the sound Joseph had warned me about. Crack. A wood knock, sharp and violent, coming from the north. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. A second later, from the south, crack. And then from the west, crack. They were triangulating me. I was surrounded. The breathing grew louder, a deep, resonant huffing that sounded like a bellows working right at the edge of the darkness. Panic clawed at my throat. I reached for the bear spray on my belt, but then my hand brushed against the leather pouch in my pocket. 3 knocks as a warning. I had heard 3. They were waiting. I made a choice that felt insane. I unzipped the tent and stepped out onto the concrete slab, completely exposed. I opened the pouch, the smell of sage and tobacco mixing with the musk in the air. "I am here with respect," I said, my voice cracking. "I am leaving this for you. I mean no harm." I poured the contents onto a flat rock at the edge of the foundation. For a long moment, there was only the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then, the brush parted. A figure stepped into the halo of my flashlight beam, and my brain simply stopped processing. It was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that shimmered with rain. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the chest a barrel of muscle. But it was the face that held me. Not a monster, but a visage of ancient, wild intelligence. The eyes were wide and reflective, glowing amber, studying me with a curiosity that felt almost human. It took one step forward, towering over me, and I forced myself to hold my ground. It didn't roar, it didn't attack. It reached out a hand the size of a ball mitt, with black, leathery skin, and gently swept the tobacco and sage from the rock. The dexterity was surprising, the movement fluid and quiet. It looked at me one last time, a slow blink of acknowledgement, and then turned. In 2 strides, it vanished back into the night, swallowed by the forest as if it had never been there. I collapsed back against my tent, shaking uncontrollably, listening to the heavy footsteps fade away, knowing I had just survived a meeting with the landlord. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the tent entrance with my flashlight, listening to the forest breathe, jumping at the snap of every twig. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the canopy, I broke camp with the speed that would have impressed a special forces team. I left the area exactly as I found it, kicking dirt over my fire ring, desperate to leave no trace that might offend the giants. The hike back to the truck was a blur of adrenaline and paranoia, my eyes scanning the tree line, seeing shapes in every shadow. The forest didn't feel malevolent anymore, but it felt occupied, a sovereign nation I had trespassed into. When I finally burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel of the trailhead parking lot, my knees nearly gave out with relief. And there, leaning against the fender of a battered Ford pickup, was Joseph Graybear. He was drinking coffee from a thermos, looking exactly as he had the day before, calm, weathered, and knowing. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he was waiting for a bus that was running on schedule. He watched me stumble toward him, taking in my pale face and the wild look in my eyes. "You're still wearing your boots," he said, handing me a spare cup. "That's a good sign. It means you walked out instead of running." I took the coffee, my hands shaking so hard the liquid sloshed over the rim. I tried to formulate a rational sentence, to explain the inexplicable, but all that came out was a breathless confession. "You were right," I choked out. "The footprints, the knocks, him. You were right about everything." I expected him to gloat, to give me an "I told you so" speech about arrogant government employees. Instead, his expression softened into a look of grave sympathy. "I know," he said gently. "I waited here because I needed to know if they would accept the offering. If you were here, it means the treaty still holds." We sat on the tailgate of his truck as the sun burned off the morning mist, and for the first time, I shut up and listened. Joseph told me the history that wasn't in any Forest Service guidebook. "It started 80 years ago," he began, looking toward the dark tree line. "The winter of 1944 was brutal. My grandfather was hunting deep in the valley, trying to feed the family, when he found tracks. Not bear tracks. He tracked a family of them, a male, a female, and a young one, trapped in a box canyon by snowdrifts. They were starving, digging for roots in the frozen ground. Most men would have shot them," Joseph continued, his voice low. "Out of fear, or for a trophy. My grandfather shot an elk instead. He dressed it there in the snow, took a quarter for himself, and left the rest for them. He watched from the ridge as they came out and ate. They saw him. They knew what he did. That was the first exchange." He described how that single act of mercy created a bridge between two species that usually exist in parallel worlds. The Sasquatch, the Sebe, didn't forget. They had memories like elephants and a sense of debt that spanned generations. We developed a rhythm, Joseph explained. We meet them at the turning of the seasons, at specific places where the veil is thin. We don't speak, they don't use words like we do, but we trade. We leave smoked salmon, blankets, tools. They leave us things too, medicinal roots we can't find, obsession stone, information about the herds. He looked at me, his eyes fierce. They aren't animals, Marcus. They have a culture. They have a language of gesture and sound. They mourn their dead. And right now, they are terrified. This was the pivot point, the reason for the chaos in Section 12. The damage you saw, the trees, the stacked stumps, that isn't aggression, Joseph said. It's panic. They are building walls because they are being invaded. Something has pushed them out of their sanctuary in the deep lava tubes near the volcano. They have moved into the lower elevation, Section 12, because it's the only place left for them to hide. They are refugees in their own home, Marcus, and when a refugee is cornered, they fight. I thought about the massive creature I had seen, the power in its shoulders, and the idea of it being afraid was terrifying. What could possibly scare something like that? I asked. Joseph shook his head. We don't know. That is why the treaty is straining. They are trying to tell us something is wrong, but their language is force. They are breaking the trails to keep people out, to protect their young who are exposed in the lower woods. If we don't find out what is driving them down the mountain, someone is going to get hurt. A hiker, a logger, or one of them. He looked at me then, studying my Forest Service uniform, the badge on my chest. I am an old man with stories, he said. The government doesn't listen to Indians. But you are the man with the keys. You have the maps. You have the truck that says official use only. If there is something happening up there, illegal mining, poachers, something worse, you can go where I can't. He was recruiting me. He wasn't just explaining the mystery. He was asking me to solve it. I looked back at the forest, the dark green wall that hid a reality I was just beginning to grasp. I thought about the matriarch's intelligent amber eyes, the way she had gently taken the tobacco. I realized that my job description had just changed fundamentally. I wasn't just a trail inspector anymore. I was being asked to be a liaison to a hidden nation. Show me, I said to Joseph. Show me how to ask them what's wrong. Joseph smiled, a slow, grim expression. Then you need to come to my house, he said. We have to prepare. Tonight we don't just leave tobacco. Tonight, we call them. I followed Joseph's truck down a winding dirt road to a small, unassuming ranch house tucked against the reservation boundary. It wasn't the mystic sanctuary I expected. There was a rusty tractor in the yard and a Seattle Seahawks flag on the porch. But inside, the atmosphere shifted. He led me to a back room that smelled of sweetgrass and old paper, the walls lined with topographical maps and shelves of artifacts, stone tools, woven baskets, and jars of dried herbs. This was his command center, the place where the old ways intersected with the modern struggle to protect the land. He sat me down at a heavy oak table and poured tea that tasted of earth and roots, his demeanor shifting from casual to grave. You need to understand who you are dealing with before we go back out there, Joseph said, spreading a map of the Lewis River drainage on the table. They are not animals. They are not apes waiting to be discovered by a scientist with a net. They are a people. They have a language, a culture, and a set of laws that are older than the Constitution. He explained that they remain hidden not because they are elusive beasts, but because they are intelligent survivalists. They have watched us for centuries. They know that white men put things in cages or shoot them for trophies. Their invisibility is a choice, a strategic decision to avoid extinction at the hands of a species that kills what it doesn't understand. He pulled a small weathered photo album from a drawer and slid a single Polaroid across the table. It wasn't a picture of a Sasquatch. It was a picture of a hillside deep in the restricted zone, miles from any authorized trail. The trees were shattered, the earth scorched and churned up as if a bomb had gone off. A scout left this for me near the river, Joseph said. Well, he left the camera. It belonged to a hiker who went missing years ago, but the film, they took this picture. They know how to press a button. They wanted me to see what is happening in their nursery grounds. I stared at the photo, a chill running down my spine. The destruction looked industrial, violent, and completely illegal. This is what terrified them, Joseph said, tapping the image. Something is blowing up the mountain up there. It forced the clans to flee down into Section 12, right into the path of your hikers. They are refugees, Marcus. And like any refugee, they are desperate and defensive. He looked at me with a heavy expectation. I can't go up there. I have no authority, and my knees are shot. But you have the badge. You have the keys to the gates. You can find out who is burning their home. We spent the next few hours preparing. Joseph instructed me on the protocols of engagement. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact, which is seen as a challenge, and absolutely no weapons. He gathered a hand drum made of elk hide and a bundle of dried sage, placing them in a canvas bag. "We aren't going to hunt them," he said. "We're going to ask for an audience. We have to go to the boundary marker at midnight, the time when the veil is thinnest, and we have to ask the matriarch for permission to enter the war zone. If she says no, you go home, and the trail stays closed forever." We drove back to the trailhead in silence, the darkness of the forest feeling heavier than it had the night before. The moon was a sliver of white hooked in the sky, offering barely any light as we hiked back into Section 12. We stopped at the pile of stacked stumps, the boundary wall I had photographed earlier. It loomed in the dark like a fortress gate. Joseph set up a small fire, not for warmth, but for the smoke, feeding it sage until a thick, aromatic cloud drifted into the trees. He stood with his back to the fire, facing the deep black of the woods, and began to beat the drum. It wasn't a chaotic rhythm. It was a slow, steady heartbeat. Thump, 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 that seemed to resonate with the natural frequency of the forest. Joseph began to sing, his voice low and keening, using words I didn't understand but felt in my chest. It was a song of grief and petition, a melody that sounded ancient, older than the trees around us. He wasn't demanding attention. He was knocking on a door with humility. I stood behind him, feeling exposed and small, watching the tree line for the amber eyes I had seen the night before. Joseph stopped singing after 20 minutes, but he kept the drumbeat going, a steady pulse in the silence. "I told them who you are," he whispered to me without turning around. "I told them you are the guardian of the stone paths. I told them you want to stop the thunder that is breaking the mountain. Now we wait." The silence that followed was suffocating. The forest was dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the fading echo of the drum. I wondered if we were crazy. Two men standing in the dark singing to monsters. Then the answer came. It didn't start with a roar or a knock. It started as a low, warbling trill from the ridge to our left, a sound that was eerily melodic, like a flute played underwater. It was answered by a deeper, guttural vocalization from the right, a complex string of chatter that sounded almost like a samurai dialect, sharp, rhythmic, and linguistic. They were talking to each other, coordinating, discussing the offer. The sounds were closer than I expected, meaning they had been watching us the entire time, invisible in the brush just yards away. Finally, a single, piercing whistle cut through the air from directly ahead of us. Joseph lowered the drum and let out a long breath. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the sage fire, looking exhausted but relieved. "That is the matriarch," he said softly. "She has accepted. She will meet us at the meadow of the fallen cedar when the sun hits the peaks. Go back to the truck and sleep, Marcus. You are going to need your strength. Tomorrow you are going to walk with giants." The sun was just beginning to bruise the eastern sky with purple and gold when Joseph and I reached the meadow of the fallen cedar. It was a natural amphitheater deep in the restricted zone, a place that felt held apart from the rest of the world by a veil of mist and silence. We stood near the massive rotting log that gave the clearing its name, our breath pluming in the chill air. I had the salmon Joseph had prepared, a massive chinook wrapped in ferns, heavy in my pack, but my hands were empty and open at my sides. We didn't wait long. There was no sound of breaking branches, no heavy footsteps. The forest simply rearranged itself, and suddenly they were there. 3 figures materialized from the tree line like shadows detaching from the darkness. The central figure was staggering in scale, standing easily 8 feet tall, her dark fur frosted with the gray of advanced age across her shoulders and chest. She was flanked by 2 others, slightly smaller but thicker with muscle, males, likely her sons or guards, who watched us with a tense, coiled energy. But the matriarch looked only at Joseph, and then with a slow, deliberate turn of her head, at me. Her face was not the mask of a monster. It was ancient, leather-skinned, and composed, with eyes that held a depth of intelligence that made me feel like a child standing before a judge. Joseph nudged me forward, and I stepped into the open, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled the salmon from my pack, unwrapping the fern slowly to avoid any sudden movements, and placed it on a flat stone between us. I backed away with my head bowed, mimicking the respect Joseph had shown. The matriarch stepped forward, her movement fluid and silent despite her immense bulk. She didn't snatch the food. She picked it up with a grace that belied her size, smelling it briefly before handing it to one of the males. It was a ritual acceptance, a signal that the truce was active. She made a low chuffing sound and turned, gesturing with a long dark arm for us to follow. We spent the next hour in a grueling hike that tested every limit of my endurance. They moved through the dense old-growth forest like smoke, sliding over deadfall and through briars without breaking a twig, while Joseph and I stumbled behind, gasping for air. She led us off the map, past the boundaries of the survey charts I knew by heart, into a box canyon that I had always assumed was inaccessible. As we crested the final ridge, the smell hit me. Not the clean scent of pine, but the acrid chemical stench of pulverized rock and explosives. The canyon floor below us was a scene of devastation that stopped me cold. A massive crater had been blown into the basalt wall, shattering the rock face and toppling ancient trees in a radius of destruction. It wasn't a landslide, it was a detonation. Twisted yellow metal and plastic debris were scattered across the blast zone, alien garbage in the pristine wilderness. I scrambled down the slope, my boots sliding in the loose shale, and picked up a piece of a shattered equipment case. Stenciled on the side in black letters was, "Cascade Geological Survey, Seismic Unit 4. My blood boiled with a sudden hot anger. Seismic testing. They were using high explosive charges to map the geological strata, likely looking for rare earth minerals or geothermal pockets illegally. This wasn't just noise. This was a violent, earth-shaking assault on the mountain itself. I realized instantly why the trail crew had felt wrong vibrations. These charges would have sent shockwaves through the lava tubes and dens where the forest people lived, turning their sanctuary into a collapsing death trap. This was an industrial invasion of a sovereign home. The matriarch descended into the ruin, moving to a patch of soft ash near the center of the blast zone. She crouched down, her massive knees folding, and began to draw in the dirt with a long finger. She drew the mountain, a simple triangle, and then struck the ground violently with her fist. Boom! She drew the caves, the wavy lines of the tunnels beneath. And then, with a trembling hand, she drew two small figures curled up in the dark. She looked at me, her amber eyes swimming with a grief that transcended species. And then she slashed a line through the small figures. Gone. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The explosions hadn't just scared them. They had caused a collapse. They had lost children. The defensive barriers in Section 12, the vandalism, the aggression, it was all the frantic reaction of a grieving mother trying to push the danger away from the survivors. They weren't monsters terrorizing hikers. They were a traumatized family fleeing a war zone that nobody else knew existed. I looked at the twisted metal in my hand and felt a wave of shame for my own species. The matriarch stood up, towering over me in the wreckage of her home. She looked at the debris, then at the camera hanging around my neck. She pointed to the lens, then to the destruction, understanding perfectly what the device did. She knew I could carry the image of this crime back to the world that had sent the machines. She didn't growl or threaten. She simply waited, putting the weight of the justice system on my shoulders. She was hiring me. She was deputizing the trail inspector to do the one thing she couldn't, fight the paperwork and the greed. She stepped closer, invading my personal space with a musk of pine and wet fur, and reached out. I held my breath, terrified, but she simply placed her hand on my shoulder. It was heavy, warm, and surprisingly gentle, a touch that conveyed a desperate, fragile trust. She squeezed once, a silent plea, and then released me. She stepped back, fading into the shadows of the canyon wall with her kin, leaving me standing in the ashes with a piece of illegal evidence in my hand and a promise burning in my chest. I knew exactly what I had to do, but I also knew that doing it would require me to be as cunning and silent as they were. I spent the next 3 hours turning the blast zone into the most documented crime scene in the history of the Lewis River drainage. I photographed every twisted piece of metal, every scorched tree, and every illegally widened access road, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates for each infraction. I collected soil samples contaminated with chemical residue and bagged debris with serial numbers that could be traced back to the manufacturer and the buyer. I wasn't acting as a paranormal investigator. I was acting as a federal officer documenting a gross violation of the Environmental Protection Act. The matriarch watched me from the ridge, her stillness a constant reminder that my report needed to be bulletproof. The forest people led us to 2 more sites that morning, each one a fresh scar on the landscape. One was a staging area where heavy equipment had crushed a pristine meadow, destroying a wetland that filtered water for the entire valley. The other was a drilled test well that had been abandoned uncapped, leaking drilling fluid directly into a salmon-spawning creek. I realized that Cascade Geological Survey hadn't just been negligent. They had been operating with the arrogance of a company that believed no one would ever walk this deep into the woods. They had counted on the remoteness of the terrain to hide their crimes, not knowing that the terrain had eyes. The hike back to the truck was silent and grueling, the weight of the evidence heavy in my pack. Joseph and I made a pact before we reached the trailhead. The forest people would never be mentioned. If I wrote a report about Sasquatch families being bombed, I would be laughed out of the office and sent for a psych evaluation, and the company would get away with it. I had to frame this entirely within the language of bureaucracy and environmental law. The victims weren't the Sabe. The victims were the watershed, the spotted owl habitat, and the federal timberlands. I had to use the government's own greed for control against the corporate greed for resources. I spent the next 2 nights in my office, fueled by coffee and rage, cross-referencing the GPS data with the Forest Service permit database. It took me hours of digging, but I finally found the smoking gun. Cascade Geological Survey had a permit for non-invasive surface mapping in a sector 10 miles south. They were operating completely off the grid, using high explosives in a Class A protected watershed without a single environmental impact statement. I built a file 3 inches thick, linking the serial numbers on the debris to their equipment manifests, creating a paper trail that was impossible to deny. I contacted a friend at the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division in Seattle, bypassing my immediate chain of command to avoid any local politics. I framed the tip as a discovery made during a routine deep country survey, submitting the photos of the exploded ridge and the poisoned creek. I emphasized the seismic risk to the lava tubes and the contamination of the water table, federal offenses that carried mandatory prison time and massive fines. I sent the packet by courier, sealed with official tape, and then I waited, sweating out the days, wondering if the bureaucracy would move fast enough to save the refugees in Section 12. The hammer dropped 2 weeks later on a rainy Tuesday morning. I wasn't there to see it, but the reports that came across the wire were satisfyingly brutal. A joint task force of Forest Service law enforcement, EPA agents, and BLM officers raided the Cascade Geological Survey field office and their staging ground. They seized the drilling rigs, the explosives trucks, and all their geological data. The company was slapped with a cease and desist order that shut down every operation they had in the state, pending a federal investigation into catastrophic environmental mismanagement. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Cascade was hit with over $2 million in fines for the Clean Water Act violations alone, plus restitution costs for restoring the damaged terrain. Their federal operating license was permanently revoked, and 3 of their site managers were indicted for the illegal use of commercial explosives on federal land. The news made the regional papers, a story about a rogue mining company caught destroying public lands. There was no mention of the matriarch, no mention of the grieving family in the caves. The secret remained safe, hidden behind the shield of environmental law. I drove out to the staging area a month later to supervise the remediation crew that was hauling away the abandoned machinery. It was a chaotic scene of tow trucks and flatbeds, but underneath the noise of the diesel engines, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, suffocating static that had plagued Section 12 was gone. The air felt lighter, breathable again. The birds had returned to the tree line, and the oppressive silence of the war zone had been replaced by the natural hum of the forest recovering. The invaders had been evicted, their iron machines dragged away in chains. I made a solo hike to the boundary of Section 12 that evening, stopping at the pile of stacked stumps. They hadn't been moved. They would likely remain there for decades as a monument, but the feeling of hostility was gone. I took a piece of the yellow seismic wire I had kept as a souvenir and placed it on the top stump, a signal that the enemy was defeated. I didn't see them that night, and I didn't hear any wood knocks. The absence of contact was the answer I was looking for. The refugees had gone home. They had moved back up the mountain to the deep lava tubes, reclaiming the sanctuary that I had helped clear for them. I returned to my regular duties as a trail inspector, but the world looked different to me now. I wasn't just checking for erosion or fallen logs anymore. I was patrolling the borders of a sovereign nation. I kept Section 12 officially closed for regeneration for the rest of the season, giving the forest time to heal and the family time to mourn. I thought my part in the story was over, a singular event that I would take to my grave. But the forest has a long memory, and in late August I found a package waiting for me on the hood of my truck that told me I had been promoted from ally to guardian. I returned to my daily rounds as a trail inspector, wearing the same uniform and driving the same battered truck. But the man inside the vest had fundamentally changed. The forest was no longer just a collection of timber resources and recreational zones to be managed. It was a living, breathing kingdom with borders that I was sworn to protect. Every time I hiked into the deep woods, I felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes on me, not with the hostility of before, but with a quiet, watchful expectation. I wasn't just working for the Forest Service anymore. I was working for the matriarch. I found myself pausing at overlooks, not to check for erosion, but to scan the ridges for the shadows that I knew were there, guarding the high passes. Joseph and I fell into a routine that became the backbone of my new life. We met once a week at the diner near the reservation line, drinking coffee and trading information in a code that no one else would understand. He would tell me about movement in the North Valley or unusual elk behavior near the gorge, subtle intel passed down from his scouts or the forest people themselves. In return, I would brief him on upcoming logging contracts, road maintenance schedules, and tourist permits. We were an unlikely intelligence cell, a federal employee and a tribal elder, coordinating the defense of a species that the government didn't believe existed. My reports became masterpieces of creative fiction, designed to provide rational explanations for supernatural activity. When a group of hikers reported scary roaring and rock throwing near Silver Creek, I went in, found the Sasquatch sign, and then filed a report blaming a territorial cougar and loose shale, closing the trail for predator management. When a bridge was dismantled overnight to stop dirt bikes from entering a bedding area, I blamed winter ice load and delayed the repairs for 2 years. I used the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy as a weapon, wrapping the forest people in layers of red tape that kept the public at bay. Section 12 remained my primary concern, a scar that was slowly healing under my supervision. I manipulated the soil stability data to keep the area designated as high-risk, indefinite closure, ensuring that no hikers or loggers would disturb the peace there. I planted danger signs and strung orange tape across the access points, creating a buffer zone of fear and regulation. Occasionally, I would hike past the barricades alone, ostensibly to check the sensors, but in reality, to leave small offerings of apples or tobacco at the stump wall. It was my way of paying rent, of letting them know that the gatekeeper was still on duty. In late August, the nature of my position was confirmed in a way that left me trembling. I returned to my truck after a long day of surveying to find a small object resting on the hood right in the center of the Forest Service logo. It was a carving made from aromatic yellow cedar, no larger than my hand, but the detail was exquisite. It depicted 2 figures standing side by side, a tall, hair-covered giant and a smaller human wearing a brimmed hat. They weren't fighting. They were standing guard, facing outward. It wasn't just art. It was a badge. It was a formal recognition of the alliance from the artist in the woods. I took the carving home and placed it on my mantle, the only physical proof I had that any of this was real. It reminded me that the monsters in the woods were capable of gratitude, art, and complex communication. I realized that the greatest discovery of the century wasn't finding Bigfoot. It was realizing that they didn't want to be found. They weren't waiting for a scientist to name them. They were waiting for a neighbor to respect them. My job wasn't to expose them to the world, but to be the wall that kept the world from crushing them. The burden of the secret was heavy, isolating me from my colleagues who laughed about squatch hunters in the break room. I had to bite my tongue when they mocked the sightings, nodding along while knowing that the truth was watching them from the tree line. I became a solitary figure in the department, the guy who volunteered for the remote assignments, the guy who was obsessed with safety closures. I accepted the reputation of a grump if it meant keeping the curious away from the critical habitats. I was hiding a civilization in the pockets of my jurisdiction. As the years passed, the activity in the Lewis River drainage stabilized. The forest people, secure in the knowledge that the explosions had stopped and the trails were guarded, retreated back to the deep lava tubes and the high ridges. Sightings dropped to 0, and the haunted reputation of Section 12 faded into local legend. But I knew they were still there. On quiet autumn evenings, when the wind was right, I would hear the distant melodic trill of the matriarch calling her clan, a sound that filled me with a profound sense of peace. The family was safe. The treaty held. I still worked the trails, gray in my beard now, moving a little slower up the switchbacks. I know that one day I will have to pass the torch to find a younger ranger with the right kind of eyes and the right kind of heart to take over the watch. I talked to Joseph about it, about who we can trust when we are gone. But for now, I am the guardian. I walk the line between the paved road and the primeval dark, carrying a radio in one hand and a pouch of tobacco in the other. The world is full of noise, of people trying to conquer every peak and map every valley. But there are still blank spots, places where the GPS signal fails and the old laws still apply. I stand at the edge of those places, adjusting the road closed sign, and I smile. Let them think it's a washout. Let them think it's a rock slide. As long as they turn around, the secret is safe. And in the deep timber, the giants sleep soundly, knowing that the man in the green truck is watching the gate.